And good morning, everybody. I hope you had a pleasant weekend despite the nasty storm on Saturday. Anyway, so today we're going to move on with our consideration of the next topic that we just barely began at the end of the last class, and that is the concept of flow. Flow was first named, described, written about by a fellow named Mike Csikszentmihalyi. He began, as I said, his work back in the 1960s, and he was interested at that point primarily in the creative process. And he noticed that the painting itself, painters were focused primarily on the process of painting. As soon as they'd finished a painting, even though it looked like the primary goal of their activity, they would put it aside and immediately begin another one. And he came to the conclusion, and began to write about this, that it was the point of the activity of painting. The point of the activity of painting was the activity itself. He then went on to interview a number of painters and artists of various kinds, sports, professional and semi-professional sports figures, skaters, players, a whole raft of people, to talk about whether or not they got into this same state, which painters have described as flow. And indeed, he determined that in a wide variety of activities, individuals engaged in them did experience this interesting state of mind called and as flow. Now, we ended last time by looking at, let's see if I've got this, if I can get this backwards. Yeah, there it is. Whoops. We were looking at the conditions necessary for the establishment of this highly desirable mental state called flow. And we saw that the first two and primary ones were these. The first was that the activity involved had to be one that required considerable skill. Composing, performing as a musician, a whole raft of them, all involved some high level of skill. And the second requirement in order to achieve the flow state was that the individual performing had to have the requisite amount of skill to do it adequately or well, right? So it was a challenging activity requiring considerable skill, and the individual possessed the necessary skills in order to state. I'm not going to go through that quotation again. And the resulting emotional state that each says, we see something like this. So we see the following relationships. First of all, if we have a low level of skill, and the challenge, in fact, in the activity we're performing is also low, the emotion we experience, Csikszentmihalyi says, is apathy. If the skill level is moderate and the challenge is low, the amount of skill actually necessary is low, then we experience relaxation. If the amount of skill we possess is very high, the challenge or the skills required are low, then we experience boredom. Now, let me make one quick point about this bottom line on the diagram. This diagram is repeated in your textbook, and it's repeated incorrectly. In the textbook and in a whole bunch of other references to this work, boredom is in the middle, where relaxation is on this diagram. And relaxation is over where boredom is. That is not right. It wasn't, this figure was originally published in a work by Csikszentmihalyi with this incorrect relationship, with boredom at the moderate level and relaxation at the high level, and it was later corrected in subsequent editions of this publication. However, many people who picked up on this diagram did not make that correction. And so this is the correct relationship. And if you think about it, your own personal reaction, you'll see that this has to be correct. You have a very high level of skill, and the skill required is minimal. Well, you're going to be bored. You're not going to be relaxed. You're going to be bored. Okay. All right. So that's the lower level of skill. If we look at the medium or intermediate level of challenge, then when the skills we possess are low, that worries us. We have a level of skill that's lower than the challenge required to do this task well. If the skill level is high and the challenge is moderate, then we experience arousal, right? We're worked up a little, but we're not too happy, we're not too focused, and so on and so forth. Finally, if we get to the top level, where challenge is high, then we see that when challenge is high and skills are low, that causes us to feel anxious. And again, I suspect most of us can think of situations where we've faced this circumstance, where we didn't really have the skills necessary to meet a fairly substantial challenge. And that would, of course, make us anxious. Again, if the skill level is moderate and the challenge is high, then again, we're aroused. There's still a discrepancy between skill level and challenge, but it's not strong enough to make us anxious. And then finally, in the upper right-hand corner, where skill level is high, challenge is high, that's when we get the experience of flow. Okay? All right, so that's the relationship between skill-challenge balance and our general emotional state. Now, Csikszentmihalyi looked at the characteristics, the psychological characteristics of the individual under 4 different circumstances: when they're anxious, when they're experiencing flow, when they're relaxed, or when they're apathetic, right, which would be high skill and low challenge. And you can see that the only place where concentration, self-esteem, enjoyment, and the desire to be continuing to do this task are above the midpoint of the scale, that is in the positive realm, is when we are engaged in flow. Under apathy, we don't want to be doing the task particularly. We're not concentrating very strongly. Our self-esteem is lower than normal, and our enjoyment is also low as well. Okay? And again, you can see the only other place where most things are in the positive realm is relaxation. And certainly it is only in the context of flow, only in the experience of flow, that all of these characteristics, concentration, relaxation, desire, enjoyment, wish to be doing, and so on, are positive. So it is obviously a desirable state, and as we'll see, it has a number of characteristics in common with the peak experience. Though, as I said, the main difference between the peak experience and flow, one of the main differences anyway, is that you cannot call up or plan or schedule or arrange a peak experience. It is always unexpected. In the case of flow, there are activities that you know from your past experience are likely to lead to a state of flow. And so you can more carefully craft the opportunity to experience flow by engaging in these activities. And as I said, there are always activities that require considerable skill, and skills, and your skills match the required skills in the task. All right, any questions or comments so far, by the way? Okay, all right, so there was a 2. Now, several other characteristics or qualities of the flow experience that Csikszentmihalyi described are, first of all, this: clear goals and feedback. That is, in virtually every single case in which flow appears, we know what we are trying to achieve. If you're a musician, it is completing the piece that you're playing. If you're a sports figure, it's ending the game on a winning note. If it's a dancer, again, it's completing the dance routine that you're engaged in. Whatever it is, you know what the goal is. And also, in almost every case, it's also clear that you know how close you are to achieving that goal. If you're a rock climber, you know how close you are to the top of the rock you're climbing. If you're a composer, you have a sense of how close you are to finishing the piece that you're writing. If you're a sports figure, a sportsman of some sort, basketball player, doesn't matter what it is, you know how close you are to the end of the game, right? So you know what the goal is, and you have continuing and updated feedback as to how close you are getting to the end point. Now, Csikszentmihalyi notes that there are some cases where this condition is a little fuzzier. So, for example, if you're a painter, how do you know what in many cases, the painter doesn't know what the final picture is going to look like, what the final painting is going to look like, right? They will have a sense, perhaps, that they're getting closer to finishing it. They'll know when it's done. But nevertheless, the provision of feedback is not quite as obvious or as strong as it is in many other cases in which flow occurs. So clear goals and feedback as to how close we are to reaching those goals. Very, 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 very important to the notion of flow is the concept that it is what Csikszentmihalyi calls an autotelic experience. Now, auto means same, telos means goal. So what this implies is that the activity is by itself the goal. That the activity is not, in your mind at least at this point, not a means to an end, but the end in itself. Your goal is to stay in the process of flow once you've gotten into it. So that the experience of flow, this activity, is the goal itself, is the purpose of what you're doing. And I meant to bring some quotations from various people who Csikszentmihalyi had interviewed about this characteristic. I forgot to do that. I'll bring them next time, I hope, and I can share them with you, give you some firsthand sense of what people in the flow experience or said about the flow experience with respect to it being an autotelic experience. Now, Csikszentmihalyi says, look, well, there are some cases where, so for example, you're a professional basketball player. In one sense, the purpose of what you're doing is to get a paycheck. There's a goal at the end, right? So how could this be an autotelic experience? Okie dokie. Well, hopefully that'll last through the class. It's obviously about half full at the moment. They never seem to put enough fresh batteries in here. Okay, there we go. All right, so I was saying, there are cases where it seems there might be an external goal. For example, you're a professional sports person, a basketball player, for example, which is the group that Csikszentmihalyi interviewed. And so you might think, well, how is this an autotelic experience? How is this an experience whose purpose is simply to be in the experience rather than to gain a paycheck? And Csikszentmihalyi says, well, yes, there are circumstances where apparently it would seem from outside that that there is an external goal to some activity. But in the flow state, you are focused on the activity itself. It by itself is a justification for what you're doing. You're no longer thinking about the goal. You're thinking about prolonging the activity itself and the positive feelings you're getting from it. So even when there is apparently an external goal, in the flow state, you're not paying attention to that. You're not concerned about getting to some particular end. You're interested primarily in staying in the flow state and enjoying it as it occurs. Another characteristic of the flow state, and it's also true, of course, of peak experiences and of other things we'll talk about, is the intense focus on the task itself. We are because the level of skill required is high, and the demands of the task are high, we don't really have a lot of mental resources to devote to anything other than the task itself. We are completely and totally immersed in, focused on the task, as we must be in order to perform it accurately and to do it well. All right? So full concentration, again, which we saw as part of the characteristics of the peak experience, are also a quality that we see in flow as well. Any comments or questions here? While we're in the flow state, there are a number of psychological characteristics or qualities that we exhibit. The first of these, Csikszentmihalyi calls a merging of action and awareness. And I wish I had that couple of quotations for this, but basically what it refers to is the fact that you, in a very Zen Buddhist kind of way, you become one with the behavior, one with the action. There is no distinction between your sense of what's going on and the activity itself. You are fully and totally immersed in and absorbed in and thinking about the activity itself. And in many cases, for example, rock climbing, you've got to be, because if you're not attending fully to what's going on, you're going to fall 500 feet and die, right? So there are certainly circumstances where this merged action and awareness, this sharing of consciousness on the task is absolutely necessary for one's survival as well as for the continuation of the flow state. Just as we saw in the peak experience, one of the characteristics of the flow state is this loss of self-consciousness. Now, again, what this really means, this is kind of related to the merged action and awareness in the sense that a loss of self-consciousness means you are not thinking about yourself. You are, it's not, yourself doesn't disappear, right? Your consciousness doesn't disappear, but your sense of selfness kind of vanishes because you are merged with the activity you're engaged in. The only thing happening, the only thing in the world right now is whatever it is you're doing. Whether it's playing basketball or performing some sort of on a musical instrument or dancing, whatever it is, right? There's nothing else going on except this, and you're not thinking about yourself. Now, one of the positive features of this, of course, is that means you can't dwell on negative emotions. Right? You can't be thinking about the anxiety or concerns you might have had before the flow state began, because there's no room left over in your psyche. There's no mental resources left over apart from those devoted to the task. Right? Let me just ask quickly while I think of it, how many of you have experienced what you believe to be a state of flow? Yeah, and in fact, if you look at the statistics, I'll show you some, it appears that the majority of individuals have experienced this, right, under various circumstances. I've experienced flow primarily as a musician. I was a trumpet player for a number of years, played in a symphony orchestra, stage band, a Dixieland combo. I mean, you name it, I was out 4 nights a week playing. Also in computer programming and in several other places as well. Right? So there are a number of activities where we can experience this with more frequency than usual. Again, another characteristic of the flow state that is similar, if not identical, to a condition we see in peak experiences is the transformation of time. The typical transformation, as it was also the case with peak experiences, is the time seems to pass very quickly. You're working away on something for half an hour, 2 hours, and it seems like 5 minutes has gone by. I get this experience when I do computer programming, for sure, right? And occasionally, it's the other way around. That is, something that takes place, that takes only a few seconds, seems to last for a long, long time, almost as though you're engaging in it in slow motion, right? But nevertheless, your whole sense of time and the passage of time is transformed in the flow state. Csikszentmihalyi also says, again, based on his interviews with lots of people who've experienced flow, that in almost every case we have a very, very, very strong sense of control over what is happening. We have a strong belief in our ability to accomplish the task, that we have the skills, and that we are in control of how things are going. Right? He mentions an interesting case where we have gamblers who achieve a flow state while they're gambling, right? And he says, how can they possibly have a sense of control? I mean, the outcome is random in many cases, right? The odds are probably against the individual doing the gambling, and yet these individuals do have a sense of control. They report that they have done everything they possibly can to ensure that they have as much control as possible, and that sense of control, even in those cases where control is really lacking, is fairly strong when we are in the flow state. Now, when we talked about the peak experience, we also talked about what our psychological experience was during the peak experience, and then how that related to changes that occurred in us after the peak experience was over. The same thing is true of the flow state, and in many cases, the changes we observe and that individuals report having experienced after flow are exactly the same, or very similar to those that people experience after a peak experience. So integration of the self, we saw this also as a characteristic that followed the peak experience. And it refers to just exactly what it sounds like. The individual feels more together. They feel more a sense of uniqueness, more sense of unique personhood. They have a better sense of who they are and how the pieces of their personality fit together after the flow state than they did before. Also, they have a more complex organization of the self. And Csikszentmihalyi talks about 2 processes that are involved in this, and they should ring a bell. The first process is differentiation, the second is integration. And as Csikszentmihalyi describes them, differentiation is the awareness and realization of various aspects of one's personality, the renewed or new recognition of pieces of our personality that we weren't aware of before. And integration, of course, is exactly that. It is the integration of those newly discovered parts of the personality into a more complex, more complete whole. And that should ring a bell because it's essentially the same description that Jung provided for the transcendent function and individuation. It's exactly the same idea. Becoming aware of various aspects, sides of our personality that we weren't fully aware of before, and then reintegrating them into a more complete and in this case, more complex relationship to form the basis of personality. So in the flow state, we get the very same sorts of things that, as I said, Jung talks about as part of self-actualization. And again, as we first discussed in talking about the peak experience, we get a transcendence of the self. We get a rising above and beyond our narrow ego boundaries. We have a fuller sense of our relationship with the world and with others after flow than we did before. Again, the very same kind of relationships and changes that we saw being characteristic of the peak experience. And again, I will bring in next time for sure the quotations that I'd like to share with you from people talking about their flow experiences. Those of you who have copies of the handbook will already have these quotations anyway, I think. But never, so you might want to take a look at them. But I'll share them with the class next time if I remember to bring the notes in. Okay, any questions or comments here, by the way? Yes. Okay, now that's the problem. You don't. You can't. Because as soon as you realize it, you're becoming self-aware. You're not merged with the action you're engaged in. You're stepping back and saying, oh, here's what I'm doing. Look at what's happening. No, that would take you out of the flow state. Right? So that it's afterwards that you look back and say, my goodness, all these things have happened and here's how I felt and so on. But not while you're doing it, for sure. Yeah, good question. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right. Oh, let's back up. I just wanted to give you one quick example from my own experience about this merged action and awareness thing. I was a trumpet player, as I said, and there is a classic piece that every single trumpet player probably eventually learns to play. It's the Rimsky-Korsakov's The Flight of the Bumblebee. And it's a tricky piece. I mean, running up and down the scales. And it takes a while to learn. And you learn it one note at a time. This note follows that note, which follows this note, which follows that note, and so on. So it can take a while to learn this, to memorize, to learn this particular piece. But the curious thing is, once you've mastered it, right, you don't know which note follows which anymore. I had this experience a number of times playing Flight of the Bumblebee. So if someone said to you, hey, play Flight of the Bumblebee, I can just play it. I just start and my fingers do what they're going to do and the piece is played. If someone says to you, play it a note at a time, I can't do that. I don't know what the first note is. I don't know what the second note is. I don't know what the third note is. I just have to start it and it plays by itself, right? It becomes a very automatic kind of process, and Csikszentmihalyi has a number of quotations from individuals who talks about the automaticity of their behavior. Things just happen by themselves. You're not consciously guiding them. It's as though you were merged one with the activity. And that's the one case that I can remember vividly where I could see that happening in my own personal experience. Okay? All right. Other effects of flow. Well, now I want to take a look at a couple of studies. There are actually a growing number of studies around the issue of flow. I might show you a list of a few of them from the last 2 or 3 years, but I just want to highlight a couple. The first of these is a study done back in 2009 in Japan by Asakawa. And what Asakawa did first was to survey Japanese students, I believe, and ask them about how often they experienced the state of flow. And he then looked separately at individuals who reported a high degree of flow experience in their lives versus those who reported a lower degree of flow experiences. And he saw differences between the two in a number of measures. For example, the individuals who experienced high levels of flow had higher levels of self-esteem, and we've talked about that just a bit, lower levels of anxiety. And they exhibited something we'll come back to later on in the course. They exhibited more active coping strategies. I hope that's working good. All right. Man, oh man. All righty. So we were talking about coping strategies. Active coping strategies are ones that actually deal with the problem you are facing. Right? Your problem, let's say, is you've got a test coming up next week or a paper due. An active coping strategy is to start studying, right? Or to start writing or researching the paper, whatever it happens to be. There are also passive coping strategies, non-active, emotion-focused coping strategies, as they're called, in which, and I'm sure many of you have done this, I know I've done it at least once or twice, where your strategy for dealing with this upcoming problem is to try and forget about it. Try and put it out of your mind. Well, let's go out and have some drinks with friends or go to a movie or something, and then I want to think about the stress or anxiety I'm experiencing facing this test or paper or whatever it happens to be coming up next week or next month or whatever. So what we're seeing, and of course active coping strategies are the more desirable ones because they actually deal with the problem. Right? So in individuals who report higher than normal levels of flow experiences, at least among Japanese students, we see a higher proportion of them using active rather than motion-focused coping strategies. And indeed, they seem to be much more engaged and involved in their everyday life, their work life, their student life, and so on and so forth. And more interest in, more focus on, more thoughts about goals for the future. So there are a number of very positive differences between individuals with high levels of flow and those who had low levels. Now, Asakawa was not clear about whether he saw a causal relationship between these two things. That is, one possibility is to say these individuals who experience a number of flow states have these characteristics because they experience higher levels of flow. It is the flow experiences themselves which are contributing to these differences in self-esteem and in future focus and so on and so forth. And that is certainly one strong possibility. We have to consider the possibility, however, that it's the other way around. That individuals who have these characteristics are also more likely to have or experience flow. So we cannot say for sure that these are the effects of flow. We can only say that these things are associated with higher levels of flow, at least in this sample of Japanese students. Now, another study, this is done in the U.S. By Rogatko, and this is a little different. In the Asakawa study, they were simply asking students about their experiences and testing or assessing their various personality characteristics. What Rogatko did was he had students list a number of activities where they felt they had frequently experienced flow, and then to make another list of activities where they almost never experienced flow. He then divided his subject pool into two halves. One half spent 1 hour engaged in one of the high flow activities they had listed. The other half of the subject population spent the same hour engaged in one of the low flow activities that they had listed. And what Rogatko determined was that individuals who engaged in the high flow or high flow likelihood activities expressed higher levels of positive affect, positive emotions, happiness, contentment, joy, whatever it happened to be, compared with those who engaged in the low flow activities, right? Again, we might expect this, but we always need proof that these things are the way they are. Okay. Any questions on this, by the way? Okay. Now, don't panic here. Yes, this is a complicated figure, but almost none of the complications are important to us. I wanted to show you this for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it talks about causal relationships between flow and other characteristics of the individual, but also because it illustrates a methodology that is common in psychology and which you may run into in other courses especially when dealing with the literature, the research literature. That methodology is called structural equation modeling, SEM. We don't need to know anything about it, except that it is a set of mathematical techniques that allows you to draw cause and effect conclusions from multiple measurements of the same variables. You can measure them twice, you can measure them 3 times, and so on and so forth, whatever. And the typical diagram that expresses the underlying relationships after those measurements have been made looks something like this. And what we're looking at here is a study done back in 2006 by Selenova and her colleagues, in which we're looking at teachers, I think secondary school teachers, and we're looking at the relationship between a number of variables. Their experience of flow at work at 2 times, time 1 and then later at time 2, the job resources available to them at time 1 and time 2, and these things would include support from the school and so on and so forth, all those things listed on the left. We don't need to concern ourselves with them. And at the bottom, self-efficacy, a sense of being in charge. We'll talk about self-efficacy a little later on in the course. But it's sort of like self-esteem, the belief that one has the ability to do things. We talked about it when we discussed Bandura and Michel in personality, right? Self-efficacy and self-efficacy expectations. And essentially the important thing here, and then it also shows the characteristics of flow over there on the left and again at the far right. And the results here indicate that self-efficacy at time 1, as you can see by the arrow, contributes to the probability of flow being experienced at work as a teacher in time 2, right? And job resources at time 1, the support received from the school, the goals and visions of the school for students, they also contribute positively to the chances that at a subsequent measurement point, the individual will report experiencing flow. Okay, so we see these things as being related. A teacher's experience of flow is related to the support is provided by the school system, also related to their own personal sense of ability, of self-efficacy. And these things contribute to each other. So having flow at one time also contributes to a later, higher level of self-efficacy. You experience flow, and subsequently it makes you feel like you've got more skill. You've got more ability. You've got more to work and so on. All right, so that's the basic message here. Again, the intricacies of this diagram we don't need to concern ourselves with, except be aware that it's a typical way in which structural equation modeling results are depicted. Right? I'll show you one more. It's a much, much simpler structural equation model. And this, again, is related to teachers. And in this case, music teachers and their students. And again, what we see is that job resources contributes to the availability of support from the school and so on, contribute to the balance between skills and challenges, which of course is one of the fundamental aspects of flow. And that in turn contributes to the experience of flow from these teachers. The one thing about this particular study that is interesting and intriguing is that line between flow teachers and flow students. What it says is that when teachers experience flow as part of their job, it also contributes to the probability that their students will also experience flow while they're learning. Right, a very important thing. And there was only this one measure, so we don't go on for multiple measures, but this is basically the idea. That again, the resources available to teachers contribute to their experience of flow, which in turn contributes to the higher probability of their students experiencing flow as well. Okay? All righty. Now, Csikszentmihalyi also has looked at whether or not what, if any, are the characteristics of an individual which might lead him or her to be more likely to experience flow or to experience flow in a wider variety of circumstances. And he's identified 2 or 3 things, personality characteristics of individuals that are associated with higher experiences of flow. One of these is curiosity. Now, curiosity is related conceptually and definitionally to the concept of openness, one of the big 5 personality variables we talked about in personality. So being open to new experiences, being curious about how the world works, these things are associated with more frequent and experiences of flow. A second characteristic, Csikszentmihalyi calls persistence, but essentially it translates again into in the big 5 into conscientiousness, right? Sticking with things, staying with things, doing what one is supposed to do, and so on and so forth. Low self-centeredness, the awareness and sensitivity to other people, a greater degree of connectedness with others, and social relationships and so on. And finally, I think it's finally, yes, what Csikszentmihalyi calls an autotelic personality. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that individuals with a high autotelic personality are those that tend to find intrinsic value, intrinsic enjoyment in their activities, rather than seeing their activities as a means to an end, a way to get from point A to point B. They see these activities as goals in themselves, reasons by themselves to be engaging in things. Right? So an artist may paint not to produce paintings, but just to paint because of the joy of painting. Rock climbers, for example, very classically, right? I mean, they have to have an autotelic personality, because if you don't enjoy the process of rock climbing for itself, then there really isn't, and in fact, again, there's a quotation I'll try to share with you. One rock climber says, "There is no point to rock climbing except climbing," right? That's it. You don't want it to end. It's not, you don't really want to reach the top. You want the rock to keep on going and going and going so that you can stay in the flow state. So individuals who have an autotelic personality are likely to find intrinsic enjoyment in the things they undertake, the tasks they undertake, and therefore are much more likely to experience flow. Okay? All righty. Here we go. Any questions or comments about any of this? Okay. Now, several questionnaires have been developed to either identify, primarily to identify flow states. What is it? These questionnaires are by and large designed to identify those circumstances or activities in which an individual is most likely to experience flow. And so the flow questionnaire is a real easy one. It just consists of 3 quotations. I'll put them right up. And it says, look, we would like you to think of or imagine or remember an activity that you found intrinsically enjoyable. And we want you to rate the extent to which these 3 things, these 3 quotations would be true about that activity. The first quotation is, "My mind isn't wandering. I am totally involved in what I'm doing." Right? To what extent was this true in the activity that you're thinking of? The second one, "My concentration is like breathing. I never think of it. It's just happening." To what extent was this true in the activity that you're thinking of? And finally, "I'm so involved in what I'm doing, I don't see myself as separate from what I'm doing." And again, to what extent was this quotation true of the activity that you're thinking of? Okay? So that's the simple, easy flow questionnaire. There is a much more complex one called the flow state scale, the FSS. And what it does is, again, it asks people to think about a particular activity in which they felt that they were in the flow state, and then again, rate the extent to which these statements were true of that activity. And these statements all relate to the characteristics that Csikszentmihalyi described as being characteristic of the flow state, a balance between challenge and skill. So the individual is asked to report, to what extent were my abilities matching the high challenge of the situation in what I'm thinking of. Action awareness merging, we talked about that as a characteristic of the flow state as well. And again, a statement under that category, performed automatically. Clear goals. I knew what I wanted to achieve. Unambiguous me that I was doing well. Right? Concentration on the task. I had total concentration. Sense of control. I had a feeling of total control. Loss of self-consciousness. I had no concern with how others saw me. Right? Transformation of time. It felt like time stopped while I was performing. And finally, the autotelic experience. I really enjoyed the experience. Again, so both of these questionnaires are designed to identify circumstances in which the individual experienced flow based on whether or not that experience matched the characteristics or qualities that we anticipate to be true of a flow state or flow experience. Okay? All right, yeah, we'll get through here. All right, now, so how frequently do people experience flow? Well, in one study in which they asked employed U.S. adults whether or not they experienced flow and how frequently and where, they got the following. 85% of employed U.S. adults reported that at some point in their lives they experienced flow. 20% said it happened often. 16% said it happened every single day. Right? In their 15% said they never experienced it in their jobs. And where do you experience these flow states that you experience 85% of the time? Well, mostly for, again, employed adult U.S. workers, it was at work as part of their job. Secondarily, to a somewhat lesser degree, it was experienced when they're engaged in leisure activities, hobbies, and so on and so forth. 20% reported that it occurred during sports and other sorts of physical activities. 18% reported that it occurred when they were socializing, having dinner with friends, and so on and so forth. Now, if we take a look at U.S. teen activities, I'm going to put these all up here at once quickly. And I've organized, again, these are non-employed U.S. teenagers. And under what circumstances do they experience flow, among other things? And I've arranged this graph deliberately from the highest experience of flow, over here on the far left. They experience it mostly in games and sports because, of course, they're not employed, to the lowest experience of flow, which is over here on the right, watching television. All right? And you notice, interestingly enough, that the level of relaxation is just, that follows exactly the same way, except that it goes up, 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 up. Less relaxation where there's higher flow, and so on and so forth. Right? But basically, for young people who are unemployed, U.S. teens, they experience flow in leisure activities, games, sports, and so on.